Welcome, everyone, to our webinar today, Sport and Democracy. How can sport promote and support the development of inclusive democratic societies? And how can we democratize the sport for development and peace sector? These are just a few of the driving questions we will be exploring in today's webinar. My name is Erika Mueller Chen, and I will be moderating this session on behalf of the International Platform on Sport and Development, also known as Sport and Dev. I'm delighted to welcome you here. Before I pass the virtual stage over to our impressive global panelists, I just want to share a few quick logistical notes and then introduce the topic. In terms of logistics, this webinar is being recorded and we plan to post it on Sport and Dev's YouTube channel. If you've not already subscribed to that channel, please do so. You're also welcome to engage on social media, tagging Sport and Dev or using the hashtag Sport and Democracy. During these presentations and this session, we do ask that all audience members keep their microphones on mute throughout the presentation. You are invited to take advantage of the chat feature in Zoom in order to introduce yourself. You can share a link to your LinkedIn profile or mention which country you're calling from. And you can also write any questions throughout the session in that chat box. We will do our best to get to those questions during the webinar today, and we do plan to have an official question and answer session after all of the panelists have given their presentations. Finally, we ask that everyone please treat each other respectfully in this virtual space. No hate speech or discrimination will be tolerated. Now, in terms of this topic and this special spotlight, this is hosted by Sport and Dev with support from the Swedish Postcode Foundation. We have launched this spotlight on sport and democracy with the hope and the aim of increasing awareness and knowledge of this topic and to increase debate and dialogue. Last month, we launched a call for articles encouraging submissions and input from around the world related to this topic. And so everyone should be able to share my screen. I'll just share my screen with a few names and article titles of some of the publications. So with this call for articles, we invited everyone globally to share their thoughts on the topic. Some folks wrote about sports diplomacy, some wrote about human rights, some wrote about grassroots experiences, looking at how their organization can promote democracy and what that looks like and feels like. And so we received and have published 40 articles so far, with more going online in the next days, and authors have been representing over 25 different countries in 6 different continents. So we're really thrilled with that response. And some of the authors are on our panel, some of the authors are in our audience. So we're really excited about that. And again, before I just pass it over to the panelists, I want to welcome everyone. I want to acknowledge that this is a really big topic and it's quite a broad topic. So we'll try to get through as much as we can in the next 55 minutes or so. We will be mentioning democratization in the sector, what that looks like and feels like. We also want to acknowledge this is a really critical issue. It's a big and broad one, but it's critical. And we hope that these voices and these contributions can really push the conversation forward, not only with awareness, but with action as well. So those are just my brief comments. Again, I'm hoping that the panelists can really educate us on their views on this topic and their insights and what they've learned. And so to start with, I would love to ask each panelist just briefly to introduce themselves and to also provide their own definition of this topic. So how do our panelists define sport and democracy or diplomacy? And we'll just hear from everyone briefly before we start the official presentations. So perhaps I can turn it over first to Andrea in Brazil to introduce herself and describe to us how she defines this topic.
Thank you so much, Erika. Thanks for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and discuss this very timely topic. So my name is Andrea. I'm a Brazilian human rights lawyer. I'm the director of the Sport and Rights Alliance, a global coalition of civil society and trade union organizations working to raise the bar for sport and human rights. So coming from that global perspective and trying to influence global policy, governance, and practices within sports, I would define sports and democracy as the combination of two important aspects. One is the responsibility to respect human rights. As businesses, sport has the responsibility under the UN Guiding Principles. And secondly, the leverage that sport has to advance democratic values. And that's part of the principles and values that sports portrays. As we know, many governments want to participate in international sports to show that they've made it and showcase their presence at the world stage. If hosting mega sporting events required proof and commitment that a country is willing to fulfill human rights obligations, sports could actually be a powerful tool for democracy. The world of sport has immense power, and it can use to either sports wash or cover disastrous human rights violations, or set high bar for countries that want to participate in sport and actually share sports values. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And next, I'll ask Eli to introduce yourself and share your brief thoughts.
Hey, good morning, everyone. It's really here in Boston in the United States, and it's wonderful to be a part of this conversation today, and also to see so many friends and colleagues from around the world. This is really a very important and a critical topic that really doesn't get as much attention as it deserves in the sport space, and really, as we're seeing more awareness and amplifying the topic of human rights, it's really also to ensure that the framework and understanding of democracy really also comes forward. Democracy is really just important in terms of recognizing individual and collective freedoms, and the ability to recognize that when we look at sport, that it's not separate from the rest of society and the rest of the world. When we look at different principles of human rights and democracy and development, that these principles are not, sport does not get a pass. Sport is not exempt from these principles of equity and inclusivity and human rights. And so that's why when we look at democracy and what that means across the world, and how it really helps to create a framework for what it means to be human, that's when I think about sport, that sometimes we don't really think about the human side, the democratic side, but really if we can begin to introduce this piece even more intentionally and purposefully, I think it'll go a long way to improve sport, and also to see democracy as a solution, as a way to make progress, not as something that we need to resist, but really as a way to see a future and a way forward. So I'll start there and continue to pass it along. So thank you.
Thank you, Eli. And then we'll ask Sang-un to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sang-un Lee. I'm from South Korea, and I am based in London. I am a former athlete in short track skating and speed skating, and currently playing ice hockey. And I use sports as a tool for developments and making the core values of society into action. So the IOC Young Leaders Program is my main platform where I address the issues and bring everything into action. So I'm an IOC Young Leader from 2021 to 2024. And along with my role as an IOC Young Leader, I am a member of the Athletes Entourage Commission. I advise the executive board about the main issues around the athletes and their entourage and how we should implement the values into the fields of play. And also I run my own social business project called the Dream League, which empowers girls and women through ice hockey in Korea. So from my perspective, sport is the main tool for implementing democracy and development values into the society. And it is also a reflection of the society. And I believe I am a main believer in the power of good governance and democracy in sport for good. And I really believe that those two values intersect with each other. So it is worth examining continuously on how we can maintain and evaluate those values. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. And then Frank, would love to hear from you as well.
Thank you, dear Erika. I'm grateful for this opportunity. My name is Frank Appiah Kusi, and I send you greetings from Accra, Ghana. I'm an assistant lecturer in sport management at the School of Sport and Exercise Science at the University of Health and Allied Sciences, which is located in the southern part of Ghana. I also stand to advocate for sport heroes inclusion in sport governance. I'm currently the African rep for the African Sport Management Association, the Ghana chapter. Right. So to begin with, there's a saying from Thomas Fuller who said, charity begins at home and it shouldn't end here. And so I would want to recommend and say big ups to Erika and Paul for the diverse panel that you have even put together from South Korea, from Brazil, United States, and Africa. This shows that the platform is promoting what it talks about. And so kudos to you. Thank you very much. Now, sport and democracy, as Erika mentioned in our initial chit chat, it's a broad and diverse area that we need to talk about. But the essence on Paul Christensen, the proposition from Stott to Murray, looking at Paul Christensen's book from Sport Democracy in Ancient and Modern World, proposing theoretical frameworks and what have you. So we hinge on this, and my perspective will be that sport and democracy, I see to be a system or a practice that promotes diversity, openness, inclusion, and where this system reflects the ideology and philosophy of the actors that are within the sport ecosystem. So diversity and inclusion has been an issue. When you look at Papadimitriou's book on good governance recently published, the issue of diversity, even at the boardroom, has become an issue. And sport organizations, literature showing that there are difficulties when it comes to diversity, even at the board level for sport organizations. And so in my view, diversity and inclusion openness are key concepts when we describe sport and democracy. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you to the four panelists for those introductions. As Andrea sets up her slides to start us off with some panel presentations, I just want to repeat a note that I mentioned at the top of the hour for anyone who may have joined after that you're encouraged to type in the chat box in order to introduce yourself. You can share your LinkedIn profile. You can indicate which country you are participating from. And of course, you're welcome to write any questions for our panelists. And once all panelists have presented their presentations, we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. So that being said, Andrea, would love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Erika. Really inspiring initial considerations. I think it was great to start the discussion. So my presentation today is around teaming up to raise the bar for sport and human rights. So I would like to start with this image of the German team supporting migrant workers that died while helping to build stadiums for the Qatar World Cup. Is there a more powerful image than that to support human rights? I think it's a clear example of how sport is a place where different people meet, how sports can be a tool for change. Sports actually brings us together in a world that is more and more divided and dualistic. Sports brings us sense of hope and a shared value. And it's also a way to reach people about something they care about. So when people feel compassion, empathy, they act. Athletes are also true drivers of change and of democratic values. So taking the knee and raising their voices against a disproportionate number of Black people being killed by the police, brave athletes have made history around the world supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. Sports supporters and fans also represent an important constituency in sports. They bring together more than 3 billion people around the world, and they stand for democratic values within sports. They also show that sports is a place where we can all meet, where we share the values, and where democracy, empathy, inclusion should be at the center of the stage. As a Brazilian human rights lawyer, campaigner, and activist, I have seen firsthand the impact that back-to-back mega sporting events had in my home country in Brazil. So with the World Cup, and then in 2016 with the Olympics. What we've seen here at the time, however, was forced evictions, increased police violence, workers' deaths, mass corruption schemes, processes that actually left as a legacy an extreme right-wing government and the biggest human rights backlashes we've seen in Brazil since the dictatorship period. But why did that happen? And what has changed since Brazil hosted the World Cup and the Olympics? And to answer that question, I have to go back a little bit and look at what is the legal framework that actually applies to sport. And that is the UN Guiding Principles. They are the global blueprint that all states and enterprises must take to uphold human rights. They were developed through extensive research and discussions over the course of several years by Professor and Special Representative to the UN, John Ruggie. These principles were unanimously adopted by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. They provide a minimum standard to which all sports governing bodies and big businesses must adhere to retain their social license. And that's because sports organizations are de facto businesses. And that as businesses, it means they actually need to avoid harm in their activities. They need to monitor human rights impacts, and they also need to address the harms that occur, so to provide remedy. So following decades of calls from civil society, many of the Sport and Rights Alliance partners and trade unions, part of the SRA, but also more broadly, sports governing bodies have adopted policies that recognize their responsibility to identify and address human rights impacts of its operations, including also taking adequate measures to prevent and mitigate human rights abuses. FIFA's human rights policy that you see at the top was adopted in 2017, and 5 years later, in 2022, the International Olympic Committee adopted its strategic framework on human rights that recognizes its responsibility under the UN Guiding Principles. However, most sports governing bodies have already recognized their responsibility to respect human rights. Now the challenge we have is to enforce their own policies. So, for example, despite FIFA's human rights policy and commitments, they have constantly awarded Club World Cups without any human rights due diligence, human rights assessment, or stakeholder consultation. In 2019, the Global Football Organization announced it had selected China for the 2021 World Cup. And the same happened in 2022 when they had to move the event because of the COVID pandemic. It awarded it to the United Arab Emirates. Now again, exactly a month ago, FIFA Council confirmed Saudi Arabia as the host of the 2023 tournament, again, without any human rights consideration. And the main thing about policies and statements is that it should be applied throughout its operations. It can't be a tick box exercise whenever sports governing bodies feel that they should apply those principles or not. By awarding major tournaments without prior human rights consultation or due diligence, FIFA in this case is in breach of its own human rights obligations and policies. And why is the bidding phase so important? That's actually the moment where sports governing bodies can leverage human rights before they happen. That's when they can put all of those commitments in the contracts and guarantees that the host cities will actually respect and uphold their human rights obligations. In our view, this is a precondition for any legacy or sports for development project that is portrayed or made public by sports governing bodies. Until they have their own human rights obligations in place, any sports for development project is a mere showcase of their own activities. So the Sport and Rights Alliance is a female-led Brazil-based civil society watchdog organization that tries to do exactly that, to pressure sports and the sports ecosystem to uphold the values that they portray and the commitments that they've done through their policies and charters. Our vision is a world where global sports is an authentic force for good, and where we can actually see sports that not only respects human rights, but advances democratic values into the very fabric of society. So as a coalition, we leverage the global audience and passion for sports to win hearts and minds, apply strategic pressure, and drive social development. Through the alliance, people that are directly impacted by sports can raise their voices together, showing in practice the values of empathy and solidarity, bringing people to action. The struggle to continue raising the bar for sports and human rights keeps going, and we need all support and mobilization to ensure that the policies and values that sports portrayed and that we hold so dear are actually promoting human dignity, inclusion, and justice. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Andrea. I just want to quickly highlight 3 things that really stood out to me about your presentation. One is the importance of the human rights framework throughout operations from sports governing bodies. A second is this question that we should ask ourselves: what does it signal when major sport tournaments award bids without following human rights obligations? I know that's been a hot topic these last 2 years, really. And third, what the incredible work is that the Sport and Rights Alliance does to pressure sports ecosystems in order to uphold human rights and values through policies and charters. So really important work, and thank you again for that presentation. Now I will ask Eli to share his thoughts on the topic that he's prepared in terms of amplifying democracy in and through sport.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the opportunity to share just a few more comments. And I also just want to give a shout out of appreciation to Andrea and the Sport and Rights Alliance just for all the amazing work and for setting those frameworks, just because I do think it helps to really create a space and amplify all that we're talking about and all that needs to be done. In addition to, I see many colleagues joining the call and all the amazing work that's being done now, particularly over the last, many years, but I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been even more of a momentum building, which I think is very powerful. So I just wanted to just share, I guess, three points just to reflect. And then, of course, really looking forward to the discussion and Q&A. I guess the first point I wanted to share is just around advocacy and how advocacy is really an important area, and how it should be embraced rather than being sort of resisted. And you're seeing that in many types of organizations and grassroots, federations, governing bodies. And some of it just has to do with the resistance to change and continuing to maintain the status quo. But it seems like organizations should find a way to be more open, to be able to embrace the advocates, the citizens that have ideas or really are wanting to give voice to an area. My work, I've been involved at the intersection of research, education, and advocacy. And I feel that as a person who's now, all these years doing advocacy around different issues, particularly around marginalized groups, around persons with disabilities, so forth, around issues of diversity and inclusion, it seems like there's just a tendency toward resistance rather than a tendency toward openness and dialogue. And I feel like that in the name of democracy and human rights and shifting our frameworks of sport, that it seems like that could be a really powerful transition so that those citizens and those individuals and those global, people that think around these issues can have a space to be welcomed rather than resisted. And I feel like we're now starting to see more of ways of organizations creating groups, working groups, or consultation groups to get input on different issues. But I do feel like that would be one area to promote this area of democracy, that all organizations of sport in different ways, different dimensions, is to find ways to be open to the advocates. Because advocates, in my view, and working with advocates all around the world, that advocates are really trying to make the world better. They're trying to find ways to improve the world, not make the world worse. And so it seems like if we can find ways to open our doors to the advocates. The second point I wanted to make was to look at the broader area of democracy and the movement of stakeholders and organizations. So not organizations that are in the sport space, but the organizations working on democracy. And in examining the space of different institutions and organizations that are working on democracy in society and the world, sport is oftentimes left out, and the sport for development, sport and human rights, different areas of sport are not oftentimes interacting with the stakeholders that are moving democracy. It seems like there's starting to be a little bit of a bridge there, but I think that could be an area that could be improved. For example, at the World Economic Forum, there's sessions and working groups and activity looking at democracy. There's different international bodies that are working on democracy and looking at the challenges, the opportunities, and in the landscaping these, it's been really difficult to find sport at any level, sport for development, sport and social change, in those conversations. September 15th is the International Day for Democracy by the United Nations. And just a day, but in terms of thinking about those networks that are mobilizing to think about where sport fits into those conversations. And then the third point I thought would be important to talk about is the element of education and how we're educating our future leaders. I know there's been a lot of work in the sport management space and different ways of educating future sport leaders to bring sport and human rights, sport for development, sport and democracy into the textbooks, into the classrooms, into different types of workshops and seminars. But I think that the ability to educate the future leaders is going to be really important. We do see, in some organizations will list the word democracy as a principle, or they'll say that they're committed to democracy, but then to really be able to make it more concrete and bring it to life, it seems like that would be an important way of bringing education forward to allow democracy to not just be a word on paper, but to actually bring it into action. So I just wanted to be able to at least mention the role that education has in this conversation, because I think that'll be important. So those were just 3 points that I wanted to lay out, and really looking forward to the conversation and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli. And as Sang-un prepares her presentation, I just want to repeat a few important things that Eli just mentioned. I really appreciate that you laid out those 3 topics. The first with the importance of advocacy and how we should embrace that and not resist it, especially to promote diversity and inclusion. And then the second, that broader area of democracy and the movement of stakeholders, especially to include stakeholders outside of sport. I hear that coming into the conversation a lot in terms of the development conversation. And so I really appreciate that Eli reminded us to think about the democracy conversation, democracy stakeholders that may not be in this sport conversation yet. And third, Eli, what you shared about the importance of education for our future leaders, moving beyond towards on paper, moving towards action. So thank you again. And Sang-un, off to you now.
Thank you to everyone who has shared really insightful opinions and perspectives regarding democracy. Today, I am going to share about the power of good governance and democracy in especially sports for good, where I really dedicate myself to. I am a huge believer, as I said, in a good governance and democracy and the impact of it on the grassroots and how should the democracy perform and why is it important in sport for good. So first of all, who should be involved in the discussions of any sporting organizations and governing body? So as you all would remember, the practice of sport itself is a human right. It is no longer a privilege for anyone. So which means that everyone should be included in the process, and everyone should be able to be visible in the practice of sport according to the Olympic Charter. So their races, colors, sex, sexual orientation, their languages they speak, their religions, political or any other opinions, their nationality, social origin, property, birth, or any other status should no longer be the barrier when it comes to those who are willing to take part in the governing body or any type of positions in sporting organizations, but rather it should be a principle that should be considered whether the organization is inclusive and diverse enough. So I believe that the organization and governance governing body should be the leading example that really implies all these values. I myself is involved in the commission of the International Olympic Committee, and the International Olympic Committee commissions last year have made a huge milestone of making 50-50 gender balance in every commission, and 13 members of the chairwoman appointed for out of 31 commissions. This is a huge milestone, and again, it is a huge leading example for making it really visible and make sure that every voice is reflected on the advisory board, and and going into further executive board. So I believe that the governance should be really implying the diversity and inclusion by all means. And after this value is aligned with the governing body / organization, it really goes to the impact on fields of play. As you all would remember, the last Winter Olympic Games, Beijing Olympics, have made this, I would say, the baby step. And then to the Tokyo 2020, we have met a much richer of gender balance, and then now for Paris 2024, we are looking forward to have the full gender equality participation of athletes. And this would have to further reach out to not only athletes but also the athletes' entourage, including coaches, staff, officials, and I believe that the example of governance and diversity in governance would further reach out to those levels of play. And after the official games and the official events have met the criteria, it really goes to can reach out to the grassroots level organizations and actions. And I myself believe that my project, the Dream League, has been hugely impacted for such movement as well. For your background information, the Dream League has implemented the first ever women's league in Korea, and the first ever women's only, girls only team in Korea. And this was really possible because there were leading examples that have proven and shown that bringing all the women and girls in the fields of play is no longer a special occasion. It should be the norm of the society. It should be the reflection of how diverse and inclusive the society is. And yeah. So how can you make it more inclusive? How can you make it more democratic? How can you implement the process that really reflects all the core values? So I consider that these three values are the core principles that we should really bring into the table. First of all, the accountability should be secured when it comes to the governing bodies. Supporting organizations should be held accountable for every action and decisions, and this can be achieved through the establishment of independent oversight bodies, such as ethics commissions, code of ethics, which can investigate the complaints and ensure the compliance with ethical and legal standards. And the second important value would be the transparency, which may sound very cliche, but I believe that this is probably the hardest part when it comes to every single member of the organization. Ensuring the transparency in decision-making processes and financial management is especially essential for promoting good governance in sport. Sporting organizations should publish annual reports, financial statements, and other relevant information onto the paper, onto the websites for public transparency. So which means that every single step cornerstone should be public and transparent to those who are willing to access the information of how governing is made and how decisions are made. And last but not least, the integrity is also the core value when it comes to good governance. This would imply any types of anti-corruption measures should be implemented in on a regular basis. The sporting organizations should implement effective measures to prevent and combat corruption, such as previously mentioned, code of ethics, and the definition of conflict of interest policies. And the further points that would be worth considered would be the importance of all these criteria. First of all, I really put the value on collection and referencing of data on a regular basis. Even in my projects or any decision making when it comes to my actions, I really do recommend every single member of the organization to collect the data, collect the feedbacks from the participants, the members of the organization, and then reference the evidence into the next action step. And also the value of partnership and collaboration is a key for good governance in sport. It will bring different stakeholders, including government, NGOs, and any private sector onto the table, and it would really enable to promote shared resources and knowledges to create a sustainable and effective sport development system. And also, I do believe that leading by actions is really important when it comes to showing the tangible outcomes and documenting and sharing the visible values to those who are looking up to as a participant. And as mentioned, utilizing of assessment tools would be crucial when it comes to the transparency and accountability. So what I mean by assessment tools is that it includes the reporting mechanism which I mentioned in the next step. So it must be easy to access when it comes to the mechanism of reporting and assessments. For example, the recent activities that I've seen is that implementation of QR code reporting system for every single dressing room at the championships in ice hockey, which really enabled people to address their hotline contact and make it really visible for every participant to be able to communicate and keep the accountability and transparency open to every sector. I also really put the value on sharing of knowledge. Every internal discussion or external interaction should be combined into as a tool for sharing the knowledge. So we really encourage the member in the governing position to share adequate knowledge on any platforms, as long as it is transparent and accountable. And which also leads to the raising of awareness. So opening about the status quo, addressing the issues if needed, and keeping the objective stance towards the associated organization will be the key in this process. So why is it important? Why is good governance important for the society and democracy? The first reason why it is important is that it really implements the ethical mindsets in every participant in the organization / projects. I would say it is the initial impact of democracy and good governance. It really makes it secure about the environment where the participants are belonged, and make sure that they're aware of how their voices are well reflected, and it will continue. Also, it really enables the management and control of risks possible. So opening the channel, as mentioned, using the QR codes, making it accessible as a governing body, it also enable the effective and faster response to the risks. Also, it really contributes to the capacity building of sport in general. Good governance in sport development involves the initiative that enhances the skills, knowledge, and competencies of sporting organizations, administrators, and athletes. This can include training programs on governance, management, leadership, as well as technical support that enables the good governance. And also the huge part of good governance would be that it makes the sport as a role of enabler of sustainable development goals defined by the United Nations. Good governance in sport development really promotes social responsibility among sporting organizations, but also the athletes around the world and fans. And this addresses the social issues such as health, education, gender equality, reduce inequalities, social inclusion, and promotes the values of sports such as fair play, respect, and integrity. And lastly, the impact on future generation. I remember Eli was also mentioning that the importance of future generation. The good governance in sporting body should really impact the future generation to be able to continue with the actions and plan out accordingly to the status quo, and it will really become the good most representative role model that they can look up to when it comes to the future of sport for good. So yeah, that's pretty much it for my part. I will say the visibility and accountability is the key force of sport, good governance in sport. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sang-eun. And as Frank it's set up with his presentation, I just want to highlight what Sang-eun shared about the incredible work the Dream League has been doing for women in Korea, and that should be the norm and a reflection of the diversity and inclusion of society. Completely agree with that. And then really appreciate, Sang-eun, how you laid out the how and the why to this topic. I really hope that people will watch the recording of this on YouTube and really take notes of those specifics that you shared around the why, capacity building of sport, enabling SDGs, and also thinking about that assessment piece. So I not only saw synergies across what you and Eli spoke about, but Andrea's work as well at Sport and Rights Alliance, which is just really special that there's some similarities across this dialogue. And Frank, now pass it over to you. Looking forward to this presentation. And I think you're just muted. There we go.
Thank you very much, Erika. Yeah, and I've enjoyed the conversation, starting with Florence, sharing on that human rights framework. Thank you very much. I enjoyed that of Ellie. At a point in time in my presentation, there will be a meeting point where the thoughts of Ellie and myself are meeting, and then also that with Sang, right? So my presentation is a short one. It's just an add-on from the article that I submitted, where I looked at a collective approach when we talk about sports and democracy. So next, right? Right. So this is where it starts. In our country, many years ago, the issue of sport policy development became a thing of interest. From where 1997. So this policy was called Sports for All. And there was the need for a direction for this policy. And governments come in and go, and we don't arrive at a particular point how this policy should be made. But now we have a new leadership under the Ministry of Youth and Sports, who is Honorable Mustafa Yusuf, who came in, picked up from his predecessors, and decide to go in a different tangent. And that is one of the inspirations from the conjunct approach in sport and democracy. So he brings on board several actors within the sport ecosystem, and sometimes even outside. So you find the National Sports Authority Board that is playing a key role in this implementation, the Ghana Olympic Committee, you find academics being part of them, the Veteran Sports Association being part. Then it goes down to sport organizations to regional and district level. And so when I look at how the leadership of Honorable Mustafa, it just falls in line with what Paul Christensen said in chapter 5 of his book, Sport and Democracy in Ancient and Modern World. He said, sport as a school for democracy, where collectively you bring people together. And this is where the diversity and collective engagement, where I share with Ellie, talking about diversity and dialogue, So this has been the approach of the current minister in ensuring that this policy comes into play. And so when you look at this shot, this was one of their meetings that they met together to share ideas, to bring on board several opinions. And even though the individuals in there might not be familiar with the international body, but I'm particularly impressed with bringing on board the Blind for Sport Association, the security services, we have the regional level academicians, and what have you, forming that conversation on how this sport policy needs to be implemented. And going by this, where we have diverse nature of the body that is coming together to form this policy, I'm very convinced that there would be this national sport policy would really come into fruition, that Ghana would also move into a new direction, right? Now, based on this, maybe I'm moving up a little higher. What should be the future of sport and democracy? And so I see a collaborative engagement of government and stakeholders, as has been applied by the leadership, where they come together, share ideas, bring several opinions on board in what would be the ideal proponents in terms of reflection of the people and the policy implementation strategy that they put in place. And so this is where I share with Ellie, which talks about stakeholder engagement, where the government and stakeholders should come together to make a decision, and this decision should reflect the views and opinions of the people who would be beneficiaries of the policy. I also see that going forward, there should be a limitation of political and partisan interferences. This is a way where diversity and inclusion find its way missing, and the democratic discourse within the sport ecosystem find its way missing. And so if there could be a way that government could limit their political influence and their interferences within the affairs of sport, then democratic discourse can really improve. It can be enlightened and broader to represent the views of the people. Now, the lens of sport should go beyond business, but should be seen as a developmental tool. Now, this has been the agenda of sport now, sport for development. How can sport contribute to society? And Andrea shared on that, that's the responsibility of her organization is making sure that sport becomes part of society. This is what we need to look at. How can sport contribute to education, the health sector, climate, and things like this? This is where we need to focus our attention to. Now, the issue of diversity and inclusion action plan should be a fundamental policy when it comes to democratization in sport. And I'm happy that when you look at the standards code for governance in the UK, this has also been captured, going forward, where we need to bring on board different view, different opinion, where the marginalized are also bring on board to share their opinion. It makes the whole engagement reflective. It makes the whole engagement well represented going forward. Now, I also see that athletes, who are the main stakeholders when you look at the sports ecosystem, without athletes, I would say there's no sport. They are the ones who would be on the field to display their skills and prowess. And so they need to be factored in decision-making, in conversations, and in democratic discourse. Volunteers who willingly offer themselves to be part of the event, offer their energy, their resources to the discussion, to the event, should also be represented in the boardroom and in discussion. Of course, I've been an advocate for sport heroes. These are individual athletes, who have contributed to the sport in various jurisdictions. And so their experiencing, their exposures, and things like this will be relevant to decision-making within the boardroom. Finally, I see persons with disability, often than not, they are being sidelined. And so we need to also bring them on board to foster this discourse of democracy in sport, where we can enhance discussion and debate in this area. So this is just a little add-on that I thought to share with our audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. And it's really incredible to hear you connect those dots between the panel, because I've been trying to do that in my head, and there's some really clear synergies, which are exciting. And I just want to repeat a few things that Frank shared about that conjunct approach and what's the future of sport and democracy. And I really like those 5 points that you laid out in terms of collaborative engagement, limiting political influence, using the lens of sport as a developmental tool, the importance of diversity, and then finally, the role of athletes. So thank you so much, Frank. And we just have a few moments left. If anybody needs to hop off the call, we totally understand. And we hope that you will engage with the articles online, reading those 40 articles that make up the Spotlight on Sport and Democracy. Feel free to rewatch the webinar on YouTube. And for any questions that anyone has, please put them in the chat. We'll try to get to them as quickly as we can. I believe there have been at least 2 questions that I noticed, one for Andrea and one for Eli. So I'll just set those up for both of you and ask for a brief response if you can. The first one for Andrea came from Vitas Carosella. It said, is there a way to guarantee that FIFA upholds their supposed policies on human rights? And just how can FIFA improve on their follow through? So Andrea, big question. Do you have any quick thoughts on that?
Thanks so much, Erika, and thanks for the question. So I think 2 ways, right? One is through mobilization, so civil society, public pressure, like Eli highlighted, having advocates for change, making sure that we call out when the policies are not implemented, and yeah, just trying to use public pressure to enforce the policies. And secondly, when there are human rights violations, of course, there is always the legal path, right? Because these are policies that need to be implemented. And so, for instance, when we talk about even athletes' abuse, we need to, this could be even a crime in countries when you talk about children within sports, but also adults when they decide to come forward. So through the legal avenues, there's also a way to enforcing those rights and ensuring that sports governing bodies like FIFA will uphold and provide remedy.
Thank you, Andrea. And the next question I've got for Eli from Joe. And thanks to Claire for already commenting with some resources on the question. Joe was asking Eli about that intersectionality and that we noticed you encourage that engagement across sectors with sport for development and outside of sport. Eli, do you have any elaboration on your experience leveraging that intersectionality approach to your work or just to this topic in general that the audience can be thinking about?
Yeah, no, great question and great conversation today. So thank you all for really an important conversation. Yeah, the intersectional approach is just really important to be thinking about who's in the room, you know, for advocacy groups, for civil society, like Andrea was speaking about. Oftentimes, the more diversity and the more invitations to different stakeholders can be really powerful to get those different perspectives. And I do think there's a unique opportunity with sport to bring people together in these ways, to actually have the democratic dialogue and debate sometimes, and allow people to think together. Sometimes, you know, sport, you just see the entertainment side, but really, I think many people that are interested in social change and development are really actually interested both inside and outside of sport to come together to solve these issues and problems. So I would encourage all of us to really build those diverse advocacy alliances and groups at local, you know, community levels and at different national levels, and even, you know, seeing what's being done now to kind of bridge those communities. I think hopefully we'll see that more and more into the future. So thank you. Yeah, great question.
Wonderful. And we've got a question that's received a few thumbs up already, and it's from Norman Brook. The question is really about how this topic of democracy intersects with sport for development and some of the challenges the sport for development sector continues to face. And he stated that the sport for dev sector continues to operate along colonial lines, imposing ideas on the global south and failing to engage them fully and democratically in decision making. So his question to the panel is, what are we doing in the sector to address neo-colonization and a lack of democratic involvement of people and partners from the global south in the decisions that ultimately impact on them? So really big, important question. And I think it also relates to my final question to the panel, which is how can we democratize the sport for development sector? So I'd love to invite each person to just briefly share their closing thoughts and anything on this topic. Frank, maybe we can start with you. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah, thank you very much. So interesting conversation here. Right. So my final comments on how we can democratize the sports, I would say that there needs to be a collaborative engagement, with the government and stakeholders. So this is why I side with Ellie. Once we do that, we'll be able to bridge the political barriers, the partisan engagements in there, and there can be a good representation of the people. There can be diverse views, opinions. There will be less of intimidation, discrimination will be of a lesser side, and then fear, which may hinder people's opinion and perspective, may also be dealt with. And so once we are able to bridge the gap where government and stakeholders can have a fruitful conversation, they can embrace each other, understand each other, share their views and opinions, understand that whatever they are doing or whatever policy that they make, it's for the people. And so then the views and opinions of the people are of key interest. I think we will be able to democratize these issues within sport. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And then perhaps I can ask Sang-un to go next, and then Andrea and Eli, just your final thoughts.
So how can you democratize the sport for development? I would say the visibility is key for this question. Making sure the representatives are reflecting the right people, right voice, and making sure they are diverse enough so that there are people and role models who the future generation can look up to, and also making sure the outcomes and actions are visible. So documenting, sharing, and portraying in the right way is also the key for democracy in sport.
Thank you. Andrea, any final thoughts?
Thank you so much, Erika. So I would add that I think in terms of this criticism also of neo-colonialism approach and Western obsession, we as civil society have indeed the obligation to continue the pressure. The Sport and Rights Alliance has been working on sports and human rights since 2015, and throughout all of the events that took place. We also have, for instance, one of our objectives is to build civil society coalitions wherever those events take place. So we are encouraging civil societies throughout the world receiving mega sporting events to come together to mobilize, monitor, and call out the abuses. So for instance, in Brazil, we collaborated with the Comités Populares that were local civil society organizations within each of the cities that received the World Cup, and then Rio with the Olympics. The same is happening around the 2026 United World Cup with the United States, Mexico, and Canada. There is a coalition being formed called Dignity 2026. So it is about applying throughout and not making it an exception, whether it's an exception for countries that traditionally violate human rights or that have historically maybe a worse track record, but all countries have human rights that need to be developed. And whether it is done through sports or not, one thing we know is that sports shouldn't be used to sports wash their human rights track record and image. Yeah, and thank you very much for the webinar and participation.
Wonderful. Eli, passing it to you.
Excellent. And yeah, just to build on everything that colleagues have already said, which is amazing. I guess I would just say this conversation, the conversation we're having today and the way that we're coming together in this unique way of bringing the topic forward, I think is really important in terms of having these conversations and actually making it okay. It's actually okay in the sport context to talk about democracy and to think about it and to really bring the research and education advocacy forward. And reflecting back quickly on like 10 years ago, the realm of athlete advocacy wasn't much happening. It wasn't really talked about, but then slowly more and more conversations to opening it up. And that has now, we see that more as a part of our discourse and a part of our dialogue. And so perhaps, this conversation and more conversations and continuing really helps to facilitate the realm of thinking around democracy. And then part of that too is also how do we intentionally bring a global group together and global networks together to really educate and really train and build up and mentor and support the next generations. And I think creating that kind of systemic approach can really facilitate dynamic change in the sports world. But again, it does have to be really intentional and really thinking globally and really making sure that it is a worldwide approach rather than just one-dimensional. So no, and again, thank you. This was an excellent conversation today, and really looking forward to continuing. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for those audience questions. Those were really insightful and appreciate that engagement. Thank you to our panelists, of course, Andrea, Florence, Eli A. Wolff, Sang-Eun Lee, Frank Appiah Kusi. Really a pleasure to learn from you today. And I also want to send a special shout out and thanks to Erika Tandon from Pro Sport Development, who helped with this spotlight, especially publishing articles on the website. And of course, Paul Hunt at Sport and Dev, who's been working diligently to get as many of these articles up and posted, as well as providing feedback to authors and setting up this webinar. It's really been wonderful to have their support. And finally, special shout out to the Swedish Postcode Foundation for supporting this spotlight on sport and democracy. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.